The candles in the winter assembly room at Harcourt had burned low by the time Danielle Hartwell understood what the evening had been designed to do to her. She stood at the edge of the floor in her gray silk gown, the one she had retrimmed twice with new ribbon, because there was no money for another. And she heard Lady Constance Ashford's voice carry across the nearest knot of guests, with the precision of a woman who had spent 40 years calibrating exactly how far a remark needed to travel. "One cannot blame the poor creature for clinging," Constance said, and the syllables arrived in Danielle's ear as cleanly as a struck note. She had so very little to cling to. The people nearest Constance smiled with the careful half-measure that society reserved for statements it did not wish to be seen endorsing too completely. Cecily Vane, standing at Constance's right hand in a gown the color of cream and dressed with 3 strands of seed pearls that Danielle had counted once and then refused to count again, looked nowhere at all. That careful inattention was worse than a stare. Danielle did not move. She held her fan at the correct height and let her face remain still. She had learned this particular discipline over the 8 weeks she had lived at Ashford Park, the 8 weeks since she had signed a gentleman's agreement in a solicitor's office in London and ridden 40 miles north into a life that had never been intended to be hers in any meaningful sense. What she did not know yet, standing in that assembly room with the low candles and Constance's voice still audible at her back, was that Edmund Ashford was already moving. She would not understand until much later how long he had been watching, or what he had decided, or what it had cost him. That knowledge belonged to a spring morning she had not yet reached. To understand how she arrived at that assembly room, it is necessary to go back 4 months earlier, to an October afternoon in London when the sum of £4,000 had made refusal impossible. Her father had died in August, quietly, in the narrow house on Carey Street where the family had lived for 3 years in what he had called careful economies and what Danielle had privately understood as the slow arithmetic of ruin. He had invested badly in a shipping venture that went down, literally, off the Cornish coast, and the debt that remained was £4,000 owed to 2 separate creditors whose patience had not survived his death by more than a fortnight. Her mother was still alive and in poor health, staying with her sister in Bath, and Danielle's younger brother Thomas had 12 more months of his article clerkship before he could hope to earn anything substantial. There was no one else. Mr. Norris had come to the Carey Street house himself, which she had thought strange at the time, a family solicitor of the Duke of Ashford's standing making a house call on a woman who was nobody. He was a compact, steady-voiced man with gray at his temples and a manner that was neither warm nor cruel, only precise. He had laid the terms on the table in plain language, and she had listened to them in the same spirit, because plain language from a solicitor was at least honest in a way that the seasoned social mathematics had never been. The Duke of Ashford required an heir. His first wife, Eleanor, had died 2 years prior, and the dukedom's entail pressed on every decision he made. He did not wish to remarry in the conventional sense. He was, Mr. Norris had said, with the particular flatness of a man conveying another man's words exactly, not in want of a wife. He required a woman of good family, sound health, and sufficient discretion to enter a private arrangement that resembled a marriage in law and in the public record. But that was in practical terms a contract. The duration was 1 London season, ending at Easter. If the arrangement produced the required result, the £4,000 debt would be cleared, and Danielle would retain the Carey Street house and an annual income sufficient for her mother's maintenance. If it did not, the terms would be reviewed in good faith by Mr. Norris and both parties. She had asked one question. She had asked whether the Duke understood that she was a person, and not an implement. Mr. Norris had paused at this, a pause of perhaps 4 seconds, and then he had said that he believed the Duke understood the distinction, but could not speak to whether the Duke would always act on it. She had signed. The road to Ashford Park took 4 hours by carriage in good weather, and the weather in October was not good. 40 miles of wet lane and grey field, and the estate appeared at the end of it like something that had always existed and had never thought to make itself welcoming. The house was old stone, 4-fronted, with windows that caught the last of the afternoon light and held it without warmth. A formal garden lay to the east, its hedges clipped with the rigor of a household that valued order above comfort. Mrs. Poole met her at the carriage step, a broad-shouldered woman of 50 with keys at her belt, and a face that had the quality of a room where everything was in its correct place. "Miss Hartwell," Mrs. Poole had said, and the name had sounded, in that voice, like a thing being properly registered, rather than merely noted. She had not seen Edmund that first afternoon. She had been shown to a set of rooms on the second floor, south-facing, plain but clean, with a fire already burning and a writing desk positioned to catch the window's light. Her trunk arrived an hour later. She had unpacked it herself because the maid assigned to her, a young woman named Nan, had a tendency to handle other people's belongings with the well-meaning clumsiness of someone who had not often been asked to manage things of value. Danielle had no things of great value, but she had the habit of tending to what she did have. She met Lady Constance at dinner. Constance was 60 and looked 50, which was itself a kind of achievement. And she wore her authority the way the house wore its stone. As though it had always been there and always would be, she sat at the head of the table with the ease of a woman who had never had reason to doubt her position, and she looked at Danielle for a full 30 seconds before she spoke. "My son has explained the arrangement," she said. "I trust you understand what you are here for." "I believe I do," Danielle said. "A practical understanding," Constance said, and the word practical carried in it a small, clean dismissal, the suggestion that practicality was the only register available to a woman in Danielle's position, that aspiration or feeling would be a kind of impertinence. "One hopes it will prove sufficient." That had been the first voicing of the label. Not crude, because Constance was never crude, a practical understanding, a creature of function. The kind of woman one required and did not need to consider further. Edmund appeared after the soup course, arriving at the table with the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to announce himself. He was taller than she had expected, and leaner, with a jaw that the firelight caught at an angle and gray eyes that moved across the room in the habitual assessment of a person who had learned to account for every variable before committing to any of them. He acknowledged Constance, seated himself, and looked at Danielle once with a directness that was neither welcoming nor hostile. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I trust the journey was manageable." "Quite manageable, Your Grace. Thank you." That was the entirety of their first conversation. He did not look at her again through the remainder of dinner, and she told herself that this was in keeping with the terms of the agreement and required no interpretation beyond the obvious one. She spent the first 2 weeks at Ashford Park learning the estate's rhythms, because a household that size ran on rhythms that a new resident either absorbed quickly or spent months stumbling against. Mrs. Poole was the mechanism by which most of those rhythms were maintained, and Mrs. Poole had a quality of patient instruction that Danielle came to rely on without quite realizing she was doing so. The housekeeper showed her where the linen was kept, which of the back corridors flooded in hard rain, which footman was reliable and which was not, and the particular preferences of the kitchen fire that made the difference between a meal arriving warm and one arriving indifferent. She did not see Edmund much during those 2 weeks. He was occupied with the estate's autumn business, which was considerable, and when she did encounter him, in the library, at breakfast, once in the garden, when they had both arrived at the same stone bench from different directions, the exchanges were brief and correct. He asked about her comfort. She said she was comfortable. He said he was glad to hear it. She did not believe him. She believed he was a man performing courtesy because he had been raised to do so, and that behind the performance was a discipline so thorough it had become indistinguishable from the man himself. She was partly right. She did not yet know what she was wrong about. The local assembly at Harcourt was a monthly occasion, and the November gathering was the first she attended as a resident of Ashford Park. She wore the gray silk, which was her best, and she dressed her own hair because Nan's enthusiasm exceeded her skill, and she descended the main staircase at the appointed hour to find Edmund waiting in the hall in dark evening clothes, with the particular stillness he held when he was managing something he would not name. He looked at her once, quickly, then away. She filed the moment under nothing in particular and accepted his arm. The assembly room at Harcourt was a long room, well lit, with the combined warmth of 200 people who had arrived to be seen and to see. Cecily Vane was already present when they arrived, stationed near Constance at the room's most visible corner, and she was very beautiful in that cream gown, the kind of beautiful that the season had assembled and polished and presented at regular intervals as the correct answer to the question of who a duke ought to marry. She was 20 and lively, and her conversation moved across the surface of every subject with the practiced ease of a woman who had never been required to go deeper than the surface required. Edmund spoke to her twice. Danielle watched him do it, and noted that his face, which was generally a composed and unremarkable instrument, did not change at all while Cecily talked. Not disinterested exactly. Not present, either. He danced the first set with Danielle, because the terms of the arrangement required a certain public performance of partnership, and she had been prepared for the proximity, but not for the specific quality of his attention. He held her correctly, at the correct distance, and he looked at her across the figure of the dance with an expression that she could not read, and that she spent the entire set attempting to read. His hand at her back was steady and warm, and she was aware of it in a way she had not expected. "You dance well, Miss Hartwell," he said, during one of the passes when the figure brought them close enough for conversation. "My mother insisted on lessons," she said. She believed they were more practical than Latin. Something altered in his face. Not a smile, precisely. A brief private concession to something that might, under other circumstances, have become one. It was there for perhaps 2 seconds, and then it was gone. And she would have doubted she had seen it at all, except that Mrs. Poole later told her she had a habit of missing what was directly in front of her. That remark from Mrs. Poole came later. First, there was the evening of the witnessing, which arrived on a Tuesday in late November without warning. She had gone to the East Tenants' Row after luncheon to return a book she had borrowed from the estate's small lending collection, the kind of modest service Mrs. Poole maintained for the tenants' households without ever drawing attention to it. At the second cottage she came to, she found the door unlatched and a woman inside in some distress, and at the woman's feet, on a pallet near the fire, a child of 6 years was breathing with the particular effort that meant something had settled in his chest that had no business being there. His name was Will, and he had his mother's wide brown eyes and a forehead that was very hot when Danielle touched it. She sent the mother for the physician, who lived 2 miles away in the village, and she stayed. She was there for 3 hours. She kept the fire stoked and the child's head cool with a cloth wrung in cold water, and she talked to him when he was awake and sang, quietly, when he was not, a nursery song her own mother had sung to her in the Carey Street house before the careful economies had required everyone to be quieter. She missed the dinner obligation at Ashford Park. She did not think about this once until the physician arrived, confirmed that it was a chest inflammation rather than anything fatal. And she looked up to find that the light outside the cottage window had gone from gray to dark. Edmund was standing in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. His coat was damp at the shoulders, which meant he had been outside for some time in the November drizzle, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something beneath the disciplined surface that the discipline had not managed to reach in time. It was there only a moment, He looked down at the child, and his face settled again. "The carriage is outside," he said. "When you are ready." She was ready in a quarter hour, after she had helped the mother settle the child and promised to send Mrs. Poole with broth in the morning. She climbed into the carriage, and Edmund sat across from her, and neither of them spoke for the first mile. The dark outside was thick, and the road was rough, and the carriage lamp threw light across his hands where they rested on his knees, his fingers not entirely still. "You missed dinner," he said at last. "Yes," she said. "Will is 6 years old. I could not leave him." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with a flatness that she understood was not coldness but a man keeping something at a careful distance, "No, I suppose you could not." She did not press him. She looked out the carriage window at the darkness and listened to the rain, and understood that something had shifted in the air between them that neither of them had chosen and that both of them had noticed. If you find yourself moved by quiet acts of courage showing up in small places, there is a place to mark that below, and more stories where this one came from. But the night in the carriage was not the turning point. The turning point came 2 weeks later. In the library at 9:30 in the morning, when Danielle arrived to return another volume and found Edmund already there, standing at the east window with a letter in his hand and an expression on his face that she had never been meant to see. He did not hear her at first. She could see the letter's edge and the particular way he was holding it, with a tightness in his fingers that was not the grip of a man reading correspondence, but of a man holding something he could not put down and could not continue to hold. There was a miniature portrait on the mantelpiece at his back, an oval frame of dark wood, and she had seen it there before without understanding whose face was in it. She understood now. She said his name, not his title, because in that moment the title seemed like a further cruelty. "Edmund?" He turned. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the miniature, and then back at her. And he said, with a quietness that had nothing of performance in it, "Her name was Eleanor." She sat down in the chair nearest the fire, because she thought he might need to stand, and she did not want him to feel the pressure of courtesy. He remained at the window. He told her Eleanor had died 2 years ago in the spring, during a labor that had gone on too long and ended badly, and that the child had not survived either. He told her this in the flat economical sentences of a man who had rehearsed the telling many times, but had never found a version that made it bearable. He told her that he had wanted the heir very much, and had said so often, and that he believed the weight of that wanting had been another pressure Eleanor had carried in those final months, and that this belief had not left him in 2 years. He stopped. He did not look at her. She said, "You were not the cause of it. I was not the solution to it," he said. "No," she said. "But that is a different thing." He turned from the window then and looked at her with something in his face that was not yet openness, but was the shape openness makes when it is considering the risk of itself. He said nothing. She said nothing. The fire in the grate was loud in the room's silence. It was after that morning that the atmosphere of the house changed, or rather that Danielle became unable to maintain the position she had assigned herself, the position of the practical arrangement, the instrument of convenience. She had spent 8 weeks understanding Edmund as a man who did not want a wife, who had laid out terms with the clarity of someone who had decided what he needed and had no interest in what he might want. She had respected the clarity. She had organized her own feelings around it with some care. The problem was that the man who had stood at the east window with that letter in his hands was not the man she had organized her feelings around. This created a difficulty. The difficulty became specific on a December evening when Constance arranged a small dinner and invited the Vane family, which meant Cecily was present and was seated near Edmund and was very accomplished at directing her attention toward him in a way that managed to appear both natural and deliberate. Danielle sat at the table's opposite end and ate her soup and watched the careful choreography of it and understood that this was what Constance had always intended, that Danielle would serve the contract's practical requirements and Cecily would serve the requirements of everything else. After dinner, when the ladies had withdrawn and Constance had Danielle briefly alone in the corridor outside the drawing room, she said it plainly. "You have managed your position here with more sense than I had expected," she said, in the tone of a woman offering a compliment that was architecturally identical to a dismissal. "A practical arrangement requires a practical creature. Miss Vane understands that certain roles require a different kind of woman entirely." That was the second voicing. Constance did not raise her voice or narrow her eyes. She simply distributed the label like a document being correctly filed. Practical creature. Adequate for this purpose. Insufficient for any other. Danielle went to bed that evening and lay awake for a long time. She thought about the £4,000 and her mother in Bath and Thomas with his year of articles still remaining. She thought about Will in the tenant's cottage and the miniature on the library mantelpiece. And the moment Edmund had said her name was Eleanor, with that particular weight. She thought about what it would mean to remain at Ashford Park in the position Constance had described, the practical creature who served the practical purpose, while another woman waited in the wings to become everything else. She decided, with the clarity that comes from honesty applied to a difficult question, that she could not do it. The following morning she told Edmund so. She found him in the estate room, reviewing the winter accounts with the focus of a man who used numbers as a ground to stand on when other ground was unreliable. She stood in the doorway and said, "I need to speak plainly with you, Your Grace." He put the account book down. He looked at her across the width of the desk. She said, "I cannot be Eleanor's replacement. I will not pretend to fill the position she held. And I am not willing to occupy the position your mother has described to me, which is the position of a useful instrument in your household." She paused. The contract was clear, and I entered it with clear eyes. But the terms as they are currently operating do not serve either of us honestly, and I think you know that. He was very still. "I do not require your approval for this observation," she said. "I only require that we both acknowledge it." A muscle in his jaw moved once. He said, his voice level and careful, "What do you require?" "Honesty," she said, "from both of us. Or I will ask Mr. Norris to discuss dissolving the arrangement." She left the room. Her hands were shaking, which she noticed only when she was in the corridor, and no longer in his sight. She had said the true thing. She had said it without a net beneath her. With £4,000 still outstanding and her mother's income dependent on the arrangement holding, and she had said it because she was constitutionally unable to do otherwise. Whether this quality was courage or simple inflexibility was a question she had stopped being able to answer. Mrs. Poole found her that afternoon in the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, where Danielle had taken to doing her correspondence because it was warm and quiet, and no one important came there. The housekeeper set a cup of tea on the table beside her without being asked, and sat down in the opposite chair with the deliberateness of someone who had decided to say a thing and was not going to waste time preparing the ground for it. "You ought to know something about Eleanor," Mrs. Poole said. Danielle waited. She was not unhappy here. the housekeeper said. I want that to be said plainly, because His Grace has spent 2 years believing otherwise. She was ill for most of that last year, and she was afraid, as anyone would be, and there were hard months, but she was not unhappy with him. She told me so, the week before. Mrs. Poole's voice did not waver, but there was something careful in her face, the steadiness of a person holding a thing that still had weight. He has never allowed anyone to tell him that. He will not hear it from Mr. Norris. He would not hear it from me when I tried. He has decided what he believes about himself, and that decision has been very convenient for keeping people at a distance. Danielle held her teacup. She thought about the library, and the window, and the letter. Why are you telling me? Because you are the first person in 2 years who has said a true thing to him, Mrs. Poole said, and rose and collected the tray and left. The winter assembly at Harcourt arrived on the 21st of December, and it was, in the way that such events have of coinciding with the crisis they seem designed to produce, the occasion Constance had been building toward since Danielle's arrival. The room was decorated for the season, green boughs and white candles, and the crowd was larger than the November gathering, and Cecily was there in white with pearls, and her mother at her side, and the expression of a woman who had been told, reliably, her entire life, that she was the correct choice. Constance moved through the room with the confidence of a general who has surveyed the field and found it satisfactory. Danielle arrived with Edmund. He had been quiet in the carriage, quieter than usual, and she had watched his profile against the window's dark glass and thought about what Mrs. Poole had said, and had not said it to him, because the evening ahead required composure, and she could not afford to need composure for 2 things at once. It was Mrs. Alderton, a woman of 60, with a daughter of her own to place, and a gift for arriving at the conversational moment with the accuracy of long practice, who set the thing in motion. She said to Constance, in a voice tuned to carry across precisely the right number of people, that she had heard the most curious story about Miss Hartwell's family and the arrangement that had brought her to Ashford Park. A private arrangement, she understood, not a proper courtship at all, and she hoped the Duke had understood the full circumstances of the lady's family before he committed himself. Constance said, with the measured warmth of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opening, that she shared those concerns, and that she believed the Duke had been somewhat led by circumstance rather than by genuine inclination. She did not say the word trapped, but she placed everything around it with the care of a craftsman fitting a frame. The people nearest them listened with the attentiveness of an audience that has arrived at the part of the performance it came for. Danielle stood at the edge of the floor in her gray silk and heard the thing being assembled around her. She heard her family's debt spoken of as a strategy. She heard her presence at Ashford Park described as a consequence of circumstances rather than a choice. She heard her own name, Miss Hartwell, said with a particular falling inflection, the third voicing of the label, now the most public, now in front of the room that would carry it back to London by the new year. She thought about dissolving the arrangement. She thought about the 40 miles of road north, the Carey Street house, her mother's letters from Bath, Thomas with his articles. She thought about the east window in the library, and a man who had spent 2 years turning a belief about himself into a wall. She decided she was not, in fact, going to stand here and let the wall be rebuilt around her. She turned to find Edmund. He was already crossing the floor. The crowd's attention shifted the way crowd's attention always shifts when a man of Edmund's height and complete stillness begins to move with deliberate purpose. He did not look at Constance. He did not look at Cecily, who was standing 6 feet from his mother with an expression of dawning comprehension arriving in her face. the recognition of a woman whose certainty was being overridden in front of the room she had expected to have by Christmas. He walked across the length of the Harcourt assembly room in a way that left no room for misinterpretation, because he was a man who had always, when he finally moved without hesitation. And he stopped beside Danielle and said nothing for a moment. The room was very quiet. He offered her his hand, palm up, in the manner of a man presenting a formal intention and not a social courtesy. She looked at his face. The discipline was present, the jaw, the composed gray eyes, the habitual management of everything that might escape. Only his hand was entirely honest. It was not quite steady. She placed her hand in his. He looked at the room, at the witnesses who had been arranged to deliver the hierarchy's verdict, and he said in the level-carrying voice he used when he was certain about a thing and needed everyone in the room to be certain about it also, "Miss Hartwell is not here because of a contract. She is here because I have found myself, entirely contrary to my original intention, unable to contemplate Ashford Park without her in it." He did not make it a speech. He said it once, clearly, and stopped. Constance's fan stilled at the measured height where she had been holding it. Her face underwent a brief private recalculation, the kind that happens when the authority one has relied on for 40 years fails to arrive on schedule. Cecily Vane looked at Danielle with an expression that was not precisely humiliation, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that the field one had surveyed so carefully had been reorganized on entirely different terms. The crowd's noise, which had dropped to nothing, resumed slowly, the way sound returns to a room after a window has been opened and closed against unexpected weather. Mr. Norris appeared at Edmund's shoulder with the unhurried precision of a man who had been in the room the entire time and had simply been waiting for the correct moment to become visible. He murmured something to Edmund that Danielle could not hear. Edmund looked at her with a question in his face that was not the cold assessment of the dining table or the library window, but something considerably more vulnerable. She said, very quietly, "I have been told that you do not permit anyone to tell you certain things about Eleanor." He did not flinch, exactly. Something in his face moved, and held, and released. "Mrs. Poole," he said. And it was not quite a question. "She was not unhappy," Danielle said. "She told Mrs. Poole so, the week before. I think you have been carrying something that was never entirely yours to carry." The room continued its resumed noise around them. The candles continued their low burning. He looked at her for a long time, and she saw the moment that the discipline, which had always been a management of grief rather than a management of coldness, finally acknowledged that it had somewhere specific to put itself down. He said, in a voice that was quieter than anything he had said to her before, "I had intended this arrangement to be entirely practical." "I am aware," she said. By approximately the third week, he said, it had ceased to be practical. She thought of the carriage ride back from the tenant's cottage, his hands not quite still on his knees. She thought of the library and the window. She thought of the dance in November and the 2 seconds in which his face had admitted something small and true. "The contract," she said. "Mr. Norris has instructions to rewrite the terms entirely," he said. "I gave him those instructions this morning." She looked at his hand, still holding hers, the slight tremor entirely gone now, the grip steady in the way that things become steady when they have stopped working to contain something and have simply decided to hold it instead. She said yes. Not to the contract. To what the contract had never been able to be. Constance left Harcourt before the second set of dances. She departed with the composure of a woman who knew that her authority had been corrected in the most visible possible arena, and who intended to take the correction quietly because the alternative was to take it loudly, which would accomplish nothing and confirm everything. Cecily and her mother followed 20 minutes later. These were not defeats. They were displacements, the hierarchy not destroyed but rearranged around a new fact. And neither woman would have described what had happened to her as humiliation. They would have described it as an outcome they had not anticipated. This was accurate. Mr. Norris returned to London that same night with a set of revised instructions and the expression of a man who preferred clarity to sentiment, but found them, on this occasion, companionable. What followed between December and the spring is a matter of Danielle's memory and the particular quality of the months in which one is paying close attention to a place that has become home without having been invited to become so. Edmund was not, in the event, a different man after Harcourt. He was the same man with less of the discipline applied to the particular matter of Danielle. The commands that had always been protection became easier to receive. "Come inside, it is too cold." On the morning she stayed in the garden too long because the frost on the east hedge was interesting. "Eat something," at the desk when she was writing to her mother and had forgotten the time. Small and ordinary and very warm. Thomas finished his articles in February. Their mother's health improved on the news. The £4,000 debt was resolved in January, as Mr. Norris's revised terms had specified, through the straightforward mechanism of Edmund settling it directly rather than through the original contract's conditional structure, because the conditional structure had, as he put it in a letter to Mr. Norris, become beside the point. The portrait of Eleanor came down from the East Corridor on a Tuesday morning in March. Danielle did not watch it happen, but she saw the empty space on the wall the following day, the rectangle of slightly less faded paper that the oval frame had protected from the light. And she understood that this was not an erasure. It was a different kind of tending, the kind that keeps a memory honorable without using it as a wall. She was sitting at the writing desk in her south-facing room when Mrs. Poole knocked and opened the door with the direct manner she employed when she had a practical thing to relay. "His Grace would like to know if you will walk with him before luncheon," she said. "The South Garden. He said to mention that the early crocuses are showing." "Tell him yes," Danielle said. Mrs. Poole looked at her in the way she sometimes did. Briefly, with the expression of a woman who has registered something pleasing and has no intention of making a remark about it. She nodded and withdrew. The snow was gone from the windowsill by April. The gray silk gown was folded in the press because she had not needed to wear it since January, and the room that had been plain and clean and south-facing had accumulated, over the course of the winter, the particular texture of a place that belongs to the person who lives in it. Books marked with slips of paper, a small watercolor of the Carey Street house she had done from memory and framed with the modest molding from the estate carpenter, a cup on the desk that Mrs. Poole refilled without being asked. On an April morning that arrived with the light that only April manages, low and clear and improbably kind, Danielle stood at the south window of her room and listened to the sounds of Ashford Park moving through its morning. Somewhere below, Mrs. Poole's voice was giving instructions about the linen. A horse was moving in the yard. Edmund's step was audible in the corridor, unhurried, approaching, and then the knock at the door frame because he knocked now, a thing that had taken until February to become habitual, and that she had noticed the first time he did it without drawing attention to the fact. She turned from the window. He stood in the doorway with the early light behind him, and the look on his face that she had first seen in the library in December. The shape openness makes when it is no longer calculating the risk of itself, and she understood, with the complete and simple certainty of a thing that has been true for some time and has only now been fully permitted, that she was home. Ashford Park settled into its spring sounds around them, the clatter from the kitchen passage, Mrs. Poole's steady voice, the horse in the yard, the crocuses in the south garden showing their first color at the wall's edge. The window was hers. If the story of one woman refusing to be only what a contract made of her has stayed with you, leave a word below. There are more voices here waiting to be heard. And everyone that you add helps this particular quiet telling find the people who need it.